Hello! In this video we're going to be going through the step-by-step process for setting up BookStack with an OpenID Connect authentication platform. Right, before we jump in too far, I just want to go over there are some limitations with BookStack's implementation. The main thing is that it only covers the core authentication process. It doesn't do anything that's kind of optional within the spec. So there's, at the time of speaking, of August 2022, there is no central logout or OpenID Connect logout standards that BookStack's adhering to, and there's also no support for avatars or any imagery like that. You can hack something in, and BookStack will still default to using Gravatars as the primary system for user avatars for new users. Also, as can be seen in our docs page here, it only supports RS-256 for token signing, which is pretty much the most widely supported token format for OpenID Connect. And there is no user-based issuer discovery, although there is auto-discovery for a single OIDC system. Alright, so let's get started. For the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to be using Okta as my identity platform, but the process will generally be very similar across OpenID Connect identity providers, but I will be showing the full process, including the Okta things, just so you know the kind of settings that I'm using for the BookStack connection. And I have my BookStack demo instance here ready to go, and this is what we're going to be converting to OpenID Connect authentication, and it's currently using a standard username and password authentication system. Alright, so jumping into the identity provider setup, I'm going to create a new application within Okta. And I'll create a new specific OIDC, and it'll be a web application in this case because it's a server-side based authentication. And then I'll create the application name, so that'll be BookStack, and I'm just going to put in there video and OIDC just so I can identify that this was for this video. But obviously you'd probably want to put whatever's relevant for your users. And then of course we could set a logo, but I won't bother for this. I don't think we need to set up any more grant types other than the authorization code. And now for the sign-in redirect URIs, this is something that we'll need to set. So within the BookStack's OIDC documentation, it does have this within the callback URL section. And so it will look something like this, but we'll need to change that for our instance. So we'll paste that in, and then I'll get the URL for our instance, and I'll paste that over the start here. So it is your instance's URL, whatever's the route for getting to BookStack itself, and then /OIDC/callback. And then what I'm going to do, I'm also going to paste in our instance URL for the sign out redirect URI here, although BookStack doesn't support sign out, so it might not be used, but just if anything does occur through that route, they'll at least go back to the BookStack homepage. And then at the end here, controlled access, I'm just going to enable it for everyone in my Okta instance. Okay. So that looks like it's been created. Now I need to do the setup on the BookStack side. So looking back into the documentation, it provides us a whole bunch of values that we can define in our .env file. So I'm going to copy all of these. We'll copy them into my .env file, and then I'll work through them. So I've selected everything there, copy, and then over here I'm in a terminal window for that BookStack instance. So I'll navigate to my BookStack install directory, which by default is a var /bookstack, and then I'm just going to use my preferred text editor Vim to edit the .env file. So we're in the .env file. If we go up to the top, it's got what should be in there by default on a clean install. And if we'll go down into this empty space here, and I'll paste in what we copied. And I'll go back up to the top, and then we'll work our way down. So this first one is auth method, and this just activates OpenID Connect as the active authentication method. So we can leave that as is. Then auth auto initiate, we'll come back to that one, but it basically allows the authentication process to be auto started without the user having to click to start the process. And now the OIDC name, I am going to change this one because this is what shows as the login button for users within the BookStack interface. So even if you use the auto initiate, I still recommend putting a friendly name here, because there are still some cases where it might show up. So I'm going to put some quotes because I'm going to have some spaces in the name that I'm going to choose. And I'm going to put login with Okta. And now down here, we can set the display name claims. Basically, what are the claims within the provided auth system token that we want to use for the person's name within BookStack. Now I'm going to leave that as name because I think that works well. But something to note on this option, as it explains above, you can use a pipe and then other claim names to join different properties together. So if you have like a first name and a last name field coming through on the token, you can join those together to create like a full name, and it will always put a space between the different attributes that you list here. So just a way to have some control over that if you don't want the typical name that the ID provider provides you via the token. And our OAuth client ID, so that will be within our identity provider. We'll go back and we'll look for a client ID. This looks good. Copy that. We'll remove this and I'll paste that in there. And client secret, again, much the same. So here we got the secret. I'll copy that value and paste that in there. And if any of these contain special characters, which include maybe hashes or $signs or anything, or especially spaces as well, again, you could wrap it around with quotes just to be safe. So for the OIDC issuer, again, that's something we should be able to get from Okta. So I'm going to go to sign on, scroll down. I can see here the issuer is currently dynamic. And I'm just going to change this up and set it to a fixed URL. And then I'm going to copy this out. And this does have to start with HTTPS as part of the OpenID Connect spec. It must be done over HTTPS. So if you put HTTP in there, it's going to fail when you start the login process. And then we've got the option here to enable issue auto discovery from the issuer. So this loads a lot of the configuration automatically from our OIDC issuer that we put in above. And we can test that this is available by checking this URL endpoint at the issuer. If I go into my browser and then I'll open a new tab and paste that in, and then I'll go back, copy out this path, back to the browser, paste that in, I can see that it provides all the configuration available here that might be needed by BookStack to understand how everything's working, including this JWKS URI, and that's where BookStack can go and fetch the keys from for handling the identity token that comes back from the authentication platform. Now, the final things to configure are all only needed if you're not using auto discovery, which we are. So these are details that would usually be fetched by auto discovery, but if needed, or if that endpoint isn't available, it is possible to define them yourself. So here we can define the public key, where we authorize, and the token endpoint as well. But for me, I'm just going to select these and get rid of these lines. That should be everything that we need for the initial configuration. So I'm going to save this, then switch back over to my browser. I'll go to my BookStack instance, and now if I refresh, yep, I'm logged out automatically. So I'll look to log in again, and now we go to login page. We can see there we've got login with Okta. We'll click that. Right, so it looks like everything's working. We've logged in fine. I've got my name there. If I go to my profile, I can see there are emails there. So it looks like the core systems are working here, but I can't see anything, and I don't have a settings link. So it looks like I don't have any privileges by default, which is kind of expected because it's like a new user being signed up onto the instance. But also I haven't got the ability to make myself an admin now because I can't log into my admin account to go to the settings to make myself an admin. So how do I handle that? Well, we can quickly change authentication system back for a bit. So if we go back to our .env file where we've done the settings, go back up to the auth method, and then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to comment this line out, and I'm also going to copy it and paste it. We'll add another one, standard. So we've kept that in there just so I can easily toggle between these, but we've changed this back to standard. We'll save this, go back to my BookStack instance, and now flipping back over, I'm logged in as admin because I was logged in before. You might then see the login screen, and you'll have to go back in through your admin account, but I was already logged in previously, so I'm still here as admin with the standard authentication system. But now I'm going to go to users. I can find my signed up user account, and then I can assign the roles as required. While we're in this interface, and while we've logged in through an admin account, just one thing to note with OpenID Connect is the external authentication ID field. This is a field that doesn't usually show up with the standard authentication active. If we jump back over to our .env, toggle between these by commenting out the standard and then re-enabling the OIDC authentication method, save that. And now if we refresh this user page, we can see this new field appears, external authentication ID. So this field contains the unique authentication ID for a user within, in this case, Okta. So whatever it provides me as the ID, BookStack stores that and puts it against that user so it can connect up the BookStack user to the Okta user. Now, this is especially important to know if you already had users within your BookStack instance that shared email address with users within your identity platform. BookStack is quite pessimistic about how it matches people up between the two platforms. For safety, it won't match just based on email address, while something like OIDC is active. So if you had a user logging in, BookStack's going to search for that user within the authentication platform, bring them in, check that ID, and compare that against a database. Now, if the user from the ID platform has an email that's already within BookStack, but it doesn't have a matching external authentication ID, BookStack is going to reject that because it thinks it might be someone trying to impersonate someone else. And just for security, it's going to say, no, something looks wrong here, let's reject that. And again, that can cause a bit of contention when originally setting things up where you already had these users within BookStack. So for such cases, you will need to pre-fill this field for any users that might occur upon. If needed, you can also set this field via the REST API or also directly via the database if that's an easier option to do in bulk. But yeah, just something important to note that BookStack really uses just this field for matching up users between those two platforms. Now, moving on to user role assignment, there's a few different options available to us while using OpenID Connect. The first of which is the default BookStack settings. If I go to settings and registration, we go here, there is the enable registration option, but that is really only used for the standard login option, as this warning is saying. But this option below is still used. So the default user role after registration, we can choose something in here to by default assign to a user upon their first login. So in this case, we can maybe say editor. And if we save that, then any new users logging in, and again, while group syncers is inactive, this does only apply for new users. So for any new users via OpenID Connect, they will be assigned to the editor role. So this provides just a really nice and simple, direct way to provide users a default role. You could always manage things manually on top of that, because again, it's only assigned on first login. So then if you then gave someone an admin account, it's not going to reset their roles when using this simple option by itself. So that's one way. I'm going to choose just the viewer role here, so that new users are already set as a viewer, because we're going to set up the other option, which is group syncing. So for this, it's going to require a few more options. So I'm going to jump back over to the BookStack documentation. If we scroll down, we have a whole section on group syncing. I'm going to quickly go through this process, but I do recommend that you read through these sections because it explains a lot of the nuances and how roles and groups are matched up between platforms. And it's quite important to note those nuances, and it explains them in much more detail than I'm going to in this video. But I will skip ahead, and then I'm going to copy out these details here. And again, I'll go over to my .env and I'll paste these in. Okay, so the first option here, OIDC user to groups, just enables or disables this group syncing logic. So we'll have that as true because we're specifically wanting to set it up, but it does allow an easy way to disable it if you want to turn it off for debugging or whatever reason. Then we're saying the attribute from which BookStack will read group names from. And typically this is often just groups, although some authentication systems provide the groups on like a nested parameter or in somewhere completely differently named. And if it is on a nested parameter, BookStack can read from those. So there's a section within our documentation towards the bottom here where it provides an example about how you can set this if your roles are provided a few layers deep within your ID token. But for us, this is going to be groups. And then any additional scopes to send with the authentication request. BookStack sends a few specific authentication scopes when it does the login process. Some platforms will require additional scopes or sometimes custom scopes to specifically get details about a user's groups and their roles from the authentication system. So this is exactly where you can define that. And I believe that's also going to be groups for us here. And now down the bottom here, we have OIDC remove from groups. And this option, while true, will remove any groups that the user doesn't match against upon login. So this doesn't really matter on the first time where a user is basically created. But it means if they're then assigned an admin account, or maybe if they're removed from a group within the OIDC system, when that user next logs into BookStack, BookStack will do its matching, but then will specifically remove them from any that they didn't match up with. So we're going to set that to true. But something to note with this option is that, as it states here, while this is enabled, the default registration role, that setting that we just had a look at in the registration settings, that will always be considered a matched role and also provide that to the user. So it's like a predefined one that you can provide to your users logging into BookStack upon what it matches up with in BookStack. So if you want like a baseline, just in case the user doesn't match up with any groups, you can add that in to ensure that someone always has a role provided to them. While this setting is false, BookStack doesn't use that default registration role at all apart from the initial login. Right, so we'll save these, but I believe we're going to need to do a little bit of setup with Okta to have support for groups. I'm going to jump back into my identity provider, and then I'm going to edit my ID token details. And then this is where I can configure what groups are provided. So I think I can just use this configuration to match or provide all groups for users that log in. So I'll hit save there. Now I'm just going to check what users that I have in my Okta instance. So I'll double check my account and see what groups I'm assigned to. So I've got an everyone group, a wizards group, and an editor group. If I have a look at my BookStack instance and look at what matching ones I have, I've got an editor and I've got a wizards account as well. So hopefully upon login, we should see editor and wizards assigned to us within here when we log in with my own personal account. So let's give that a go. I'm going to log out now, and then we can see the login with Okta, because again, earlier we changed it back to OIDC for authentication. And I'll click login with Okta. Cool. And that's a bit more hopeful because now I can see details. And if I have a look at my own profile, I can see I'm part of the editor and the wizards roles. And luckily for me, wizards does basically have admin privileges. So it's allowed me to see everything up here and access the settings and view my own roles as well, which I wouldn't normally be able to do. So we can see that's working quite nicely, but let's test it out. So I'm going to log out. And then we'll just double check and make sure, yep, I did have the remove from groups option as true. So if I remove myself from the wizards group, we should expect to see my admin privileges go away, or at least I won't be part of that wizards group within BookStack. I'll remove myself there. I'll log in again, and there we go. Now I can't see the settings link, and if I try and edit my profile, I don't see the roles because I'm not a wizard, and then I don't have admin privileges. So that all looks like it's working pretty well. Right, I've just reassigned myself as a wizard within the authentication platform. So I'm going to log out and then log back in just so I get those privileges back. There we go. Because now I want to show you how you might map up roles where their names don't align. So right now, we've just mapped up wizards and editor based solely on the names here. But matching on name alone might not be possible in all environments. You might have a set naming scheme within your identity platform that you then doesn't make sense to use within BookStack. So there are ways around this. So as an example of this, I'm going to create a new role and call this all users. And I want this to match up with the everyone group within Okta here. So of course, I don't want to change all users. That's the name that I want within BookStack. But when we have the auth method of OIDC active within our .env file, we also see this field here, the external authentication IDs. Much like we had for users earlier, this is one that's specific to roles, and this allows us to create some custom mapping here. So within here, we can put in everyone to match up with Okta. Now, BookStack does some normalization of the names here, and I believe it's lowercasing than hyphenating when instead of spacing, just to try and align things across platform. And again, all of that is detailed very much within our documentation here. And another thing to note is that you can list multiple IDs within here by using a comma, adding another name within here. And that way you can map many ID provider groups to a single BookStack role if needed. But we'll stick with everyone in this case. So let's give that a test. We'll save this role. And now if we log out and log back in, we should expect that I'm added to that all users role. We logged in, we'll edit me to see what roles I've got. And there we go. I've got all users because it's mapped that everyone to the all users role. So to set up the authentication and the group sync, there's been a lot of mapping between platforms, and we've had to kind of align details. And sometimes it can be quite difficult to see if there's any misalignment between these platforms. To help with this, and to help with debugging in general, BookStack does provide an option. So within the debugging part of our documentation, we have this extra option that we can use. So we'll copy this out, and once again, we'll add it to our .env. And then as it states here, this will dump out the details fetched from the identity provider. so we can have some insight to see exactly what BookStack is gaining from our identity provider, see if there's any misalignments there. So we'll set this to true, but as it mentions here, while this is active, this will display information and stop logins. So be careful about how you use this, especially if you're on a big public server or you've got users that are supposed to be logging in and out. This will stop logins, dump out details that might be private. But for our purposes, we'll activate this debugging option, and we'll save that. We'll jump back into our BookStack instance. I'll log out, but now upon login, we get this output, which Firefox has formatted for me, but I'll have a look at the raw JSON and then pretty print that. And now we can have some insight to see exactly what Okta in this case is providing me. So we can see the property of name, which is what we're setting for our option up here for the display name claims. So if you wanted to use other things, you could have a look in here, see what properties you want, and then update this option here to be those claim names. And of course, this is very useful when you're doing the group mapping. So down here, we can see the groups and see exactly the values that Okta is providing us. So if you didn't know exactly where that property lies, or you're wondering if it even exists and why you might not be getting any mapping between platforms, you can add this dump option and be able to see straight away whether you're getting anything back from the identity platform. So yeah, definitely worth using that option if you run into any mapping issues. Right, so I've now set the dump option back to false. So we're no longer blocking logins and dumping out details. And then I've just put my BookStack instance back into a default state. So I'm not looking at all the details that are dumped out. And I want to go through one last option, which is if we go up to where we initially pasted in these details, is the auto initiate option. So as I touched on earlier, this allows you to automatically start the authentication process. So we'll give this a test by changing this to true, and then we'll save this and then jump back into the browser. Now we're on the login screen here from earlier, but now I'm just going to reload this. There we go. So we didn't need to click the button first. We saw kind of a little loading animation to say that it's starting the login process, and then it immediately took us there. So a nice way to provide less friction for users getting into your BookStack instance where you're using something like OIDC. Now this only works if it's your only authentication method active. So if you set up any social providers like Google login or Twitter login or anything like that, that option is just going to do nothing effectively, and it's not going to automatically start the OIDC authentication process because a user might want to use something different, so it doesn't attempt to force a user down a specific path. This doesn't mean that the button won't ever be shown, hence my recommendation to set a sensible name earlier, because if we go to log out, then the user will still see that login screen, so then it's just one click if they wanted to log back in. But again, if they were going to this new, so if we just pretend that we're going to like the /books endpoint, and we're in a currently logged out state, again, we'll see that automatic process, and then we're going to go straight there to the books page, because that's where the URL was trying to take us. So yeah, probably something that you'd want on if it's your only authentication option, because it's, yeah, provides a much nicer experience. All right, that's everything that I've got to cover on OpenID Connect authentication within BookStack. Hopefully your setup process goes relatively smooth. If you do have any issues, you can always pop into the BookStack Discord channels. That's usually the best place for kind of quick, informal help. Otherwise, there might be some past stuff you can find on our GitHub issues page, or you can feel free to comment below, although it's usually a little bit harder to discuss technical things within YouTube comments. But yeah, good luck with your instance. Hope everything goes all right, and have a wonderful day.